Welcome, and thank you for attending my presentation about Wilhelm. Wilhelm was once the strongest swordsman of his era, surpassing even the sword saint of that time. It is interesting to see how his presence redefined the history of the past of the country of Lugunica, but it is even more fascinating to know that when the author introduced him to the story, Tappé only intended Wilhelm to be a simple carriage driver. But now I will tell you the story of all his past prior to the anime, as well as other interesting aspects of his character, such as his feelings, his strength, and his future. Wilhelm lived on the borders of the kingdom. The territory of his family bordered the northern regions of Conejotako, and although his family seemed important, it was actually a noble family already in decline. It is implied that Wilhelm was one of the youngest children, so as he lacked a right to succession or the political ability to help his family, he decided to simply retire and live on his own. That is how he began to make a name for himself in the kingdom. At that time, the country was at war with the demi-humans, so Wilhelm enlisted in the army by lying about his age. He was actually 14 years old, but gave a much older age. The truth was that the lie was obvious, but since the kingdom needed people, they turned a blind eye to it. Since Wilhelm had trained with the sword for 6 years, his skill level was high, but in battle, he transformed into a beast that mercilessly annihilated his enemies. For this reason, he earned the nickname Sword Demon. Even though the kingdom wanted to promote him, it was difficult to do so because Wilhelm himself rejected the promotion. And the fact that he was a soulless knight who fought for personal pleasure instead of fighting to defend someone made things complicated. Wilhelm needed to change, and that change would come through his friends and later through Trias. Wilhelm was not a very socially open person. He was very blunt with his words, but even with all his sharpness, there would eventually be people who would open their hearts to him. At first, he did not react to this and considered social relationships a waste of time. However, little by little, his heart began to open. Unfortunately, some tragedies had to occur for this to happen, such as the complete death of his first battle squadron or the accident of his best friend Grimm, who received a lethal wound to his throat and ended up losing his voice while protecting him. Moreover, the meetings he had with Trias made him realize that he was not as heartless as he believed. He did not run away from home because he was bored and wanted a name for himself, but rather he fled from there because he also wanted to help support his family. However, as he lacked political acumen or the right to succession, he decided to seek a path through his sword. Now that Wilhelm is aware of this, his battle companions begin to notice a change in his attitude, and thus, finally, a promotion came for him. At the same time, he had started to enjoy the afternoons he spent with the flower girl, who was Trias, and who apparently was a normal village girl with nothing outstanding. Unfortunately, one day he learns that the remaining demi-humans planned a large-scale attack on his hometown. Wilhelm knew that even if he asked for help, the army would take at least 1 or 2 days to arrive, so he went alone against the entire demi-human army. It is said that Wilhelm arrived late and blinded by rage, killed all the demi-humans he could, but it was not enough, and when he thought he was going to die, he was saved by that ordinary village girl. It is here that he learns the true identity of Trias, who was the next holy sword of the kingdom and had until then been inactive. Wilhelm knew that she was a peaceful person who did not enjoy war, which is why he swore at that moment that he would defeat her and take her away from that bloody life. But he did not say that out of resentment or anything like that. He said it because he knew that she was not happy being the weapon of the kingdom. Wilhelm would disappear from public life for 2 years after that incident. No one knew where he went or what he was doing. Some even believed he had died. But the truth is that he had been wandering for 2 years, going to every corner of the country improving his swordsmanship, and when he reached a high level as a swordsman, he headed to an event for Tiresias' coronation. It is there that we would see the scene from the anime in which he confronts her and forces her to abandon her role as the Holy Sword. Not for any sexist or egotistical reason, but because he knew that was not what she wanted. While up to this point it sounds like a nice story, the truth is that things became complicated at this moment for both of them. Firstly, Wilhelm was unemployed for having abandoned the army, And since he left the country in the middle of a war, the high military command was resentful and had sworn to make his life miserable. Moreover, Teresia's family was not at all pleased that their daughter had lost and was in love with the man who had defeated her. Additionally, the announcement of their eventual wedding made her father shout to the heavens and behave like a total idiot with his future son-in-law and daughter. Eventually, Wilhelm's father came to his senses and even gave his blessing to the newlyweds, but many things happened in between. One of these events was that the king at the time agreed to grant a request from Wilhelm. His request was for Teresia to lay down her sword, but the king would only agree to this if Wilhelm proved to be much more useful than her. To determine this, the king made Wilhelm face the entire nation's army on his own. Thus, we witness Wilhelm fighting all his allies for the sake of his future wife. In the end, he emerged victorious, and the king granted his request. After the wedding, when Wilhelm and his wife went on their honeymoon, things were not easy. Wilhelm ended up meeting Stride Wallachia, the Archbishop of Pride. Moreover, he did not just encounter Stride, but also his second-in-command, Kurgan, the strongest warrior of the multi-armed tribe. Since Stride had attacked and offended his father-in-law, Wilhelm was forced to fight the Archbishop's subordinate, leading to an epic battle that was recorded in the world song sung by Liliana. Unfortunately, the battle was interrupted, and Wilhelm was forced to retreat, though something told him this was not the end of the situation. Not long after, Stride reappeared, now with newfound forces, and managed to put the nation of Lugunica and Wilhelm himself in check. The archbishop ended up killing Wilhelm's father-in-law and kidnapping his wife. As a result, the young swordsman had to track down and confront the enemy once and for all. For this, he had the help of the Roswal of that time and, ironically, some of his old enemies from the demi-human war, such as Rom. However, these allies did not assist for the sake of humans, but because they knew this war would also affect their own race. This war was incredibly important, and even now, as I write this script, the author of ReZero recently rewrote the events of this war to adapt them to the current canon. In other words, he updated them based on the new directions of Arc 9, which is where the novel currently stands. The most notable aspect of this war was that, for the first time, we saw a dragon being controlled by the enemy and used against the kingdom. However, this threat prompted the appearance of the sacred dragon Volcanica, a dragon that, 4 centuries ago, made a pact with the kingdom of Lugunica. In that pact, it was stipulated that, in the face of an imminent catastrophe, Volcanica would appear to help. That is exactly what happened. Volcanica appeared and subdued the enemy dragon as if it were a mere child. And if you are wondering what happened to the archbishop, he ended up being devoured by his own dragon. But believe it or not, this was intentional. Only now would Wilhelm live a life of relative peace. Eventually, his son was born, a character greatly loved by the fandom named Heinkel. After this, there are not many details about this period of his life, and proof of this is that the next thing we know about these days is that Heinkel had already married and had his son, Reinhard. However, 2 years later, Heinkel's wife fell into a coma, which brought a lot of stress to the young husband. Unfortunately, another event would occur that would complicate the situation greatly. During those days, it was revealed that the king's most recent daughter had been kidnapped by some thieves inside the castle. So Wilhelm was assigned to resolve the case. At the same time, the location of the white whale was revealed, and the newly promoted Vice Captain Heinkel was tasked with leading the subjugation. Heinkel was afraid of not returning alive and never seeing his son or wife again. So his mother, moved by this, was the one who ended up offering herself as a replacement to go on this expedition. An expedition where she would ultimately find her death. The news of this event hit the Astria family hard. Perhaps Wilhelm was the most affected, or perhaps not. I do not think it is good to try to calculate that. As soon as he learned of his wife's death, he fell into a deep madness and fury, to the point that he detached himself from his family, from his work, and from his friends. We are told how he left his position as captain of the Royal Guard, and also left the Astria family. He did all this because he had made the subjugation of the white whale his new objective. He was so obsessed with this that he even reached the point of threatening his old friend Bordeaux, and for this, he was temporarily imprisoned. Upon leaving this brief imprisonment, he would meet Crush, who by then was already a candidate for the royal selection, and she would be the one to offer him the opportunity to help her with his revenge in exchange for him showing support for her candidacy. And this is how Wilhelm arrives at episode 1 of the anime. As I said at the beginning, Wilhelm was and is an outstanding swordsman, but he has not exhibited great techniques like those of Reinhard or Seculus. We only know that he has great mastery of the sword, and that is it. We do not know of any particular technique. We are only told that his attacks are precise, timely, and descriptions of that type. This is somewhat disappointing when the author sells us the idea that his level as a swordsman was on par with Cecilus, but at least the latter has swords that are at his level, such as the legendary Muramasa sword and the Dream Eater sword. Wilhelm only has his health and a special sword that was gifted to him by his father-in-law on his honeymoon. He named this sword the Holy Sword Astria. But when he left the family, he left the sword behind. It is now in Heinkel's possession. I know I mentioned at the start of the video that he was the strongest swordsman of his era, but there is some debate, not regarding his swordsmanship, but because the author stated that he was actually the strongest human of his time. This would imply that Wilhelm was stronger than Regulus, which kind of contradicts that statement. Personally, I think Tappe was referring to him as the strongest swordsman, not the strongest human. That being said, this applies to Wilhelm in his prime. The current Wilhelm is far from his glory days. Yes, he's still strong, but he no longer has the same capabilities as his version from decades ago. I would say he is stronger than Julius from episode 1, but weaker than Julius at the end of arc 6. It's known that he has taken the lives of hundreds of demi-humans. We don't have an exact confirmation, but he killed so many that the entire race agreed to launch a large-scale attack on his homeland. He also defeated one of the greatest leaders of this race, the old Rom. Rom used to be one of the leaders of the demi-human faction and was also a tough rival for Wilhelm. In fact, Rom nearly killed him on one occasion. Wilhelm also holds a grudge against him because Rom was responsible for the deaths of some of his close friends. In the canon, we don't yet have confirmation of a reunion between the two, but we do know that in an alternative route, they met again and looked at each other with absolute hatred and contempt. I wonder what Wilhelm would think upon learning that his grandson is close to a man he despises so much. For now, he doesn't know, but Wilhelm's old war comrades, Carol and Grimm, are already aware of it. However, since they stopped speaking years ago, it seems Wilhelm hasn't found out. It's also worth mentioning the time Wilhelm single-handedly defeated the entire army of Lugunica. Maybe you're not familiar with many of the warriors in this image, but I can assure you they were the best of that era, and they were no small challenge. Among his other feats, he also defeated Kurgan. While Kurgan was just a servant of Stride, it doesn't take away from the fact that this blue-skinned man was the strongest in the neighboring country at the time. This is just my interpretation, and I could be wrong, but I recall Wilhelm being capable of defeating the dragon Valgren, the dragon that the archbishop used to attack the nation of Lugunica. However, by that point, Wilhelm was already injured. Even so, I'm sure he could have defeated it, but the dragon Volcanica had already arrived to take care of it. Regarding his fight with the archbishop, yes, Wilhelm won, but it is not that he attacked him. It just happens that these two never fought, and that is because Stride was not strong. He was just a sick man who always attacked with complex plans. And if anyone was going to fight, it was not him. After this, I think the only remaining achievement is the achievement of having contributed to the defeat of the White Whale. But that is something we already saw in the anime, so let us close this part. I find it very interesting how in an alternative story, when he is erased from existence by gluttony, it is said that the relationship between Reinhard and Heinkel improved considerably due to Wilhelm's disappearance. And that is because whether we want it or not, Wilhelm was greatly to blame for accusing Reinhard of being a murderer and abandoning his son at his lowest moment. That is why I find it logical that when Wilhelm was erased, Reinhard's relationship with his father improved, although of course this was due to a lie. In the Pre-Stella arc, I really like the conclusion of this part. Wilhelm remains sad and angry because his wife has died again. But unlike the first time this happened, now he is up to the situation and does what he should have done the first time. Except that although he is bitter, he should not direct his hatred toward Reinhard or his son. Now he only asks to please be left alone while he takes the time to process what happened. After this, we have not heard any news or mention of him again, and I know there is a debate in the fandom regarding some words he has with Subaru after the second death of his wife. In this conversation, he seems to want to tell Subaru something, but stops, as at that moment Subaru finished comforting him for the death of his wife and consoled him in a way that Reinhard did not. Some say that at that moment Wilhelm wanted to tell him that he wished he were his grandson. I think that is a valid interpretation, but I also believe that another thing he could have said was that if he could become his reason to raise the sword again, since at that moment, the only reason he had left for this had died. Currently, Wilhelm is very lonely. His wife is dead, his family is destroyed, and while he has friends, he set everyone aside when he became obsessed with revenge against the White Whale. Experiencing the death of his wife again must have awakened old traumas. But while before he had friends to rely on, now he simply has no one. Yes, I know Crush could be that friend, but the amnesiac Crush does not know much about Wilhelm's situation. And Felix, well, he is Felix. Only Subaru is someone he can treat as a friend these days. And just as his first friends in his youth gave him a reason to take up the sword, I find it plausible that, in his old age, he might see his friendship with Subaru as a new reason to wield the sword. But remember, this is just a second interpretation. I also really like the interpretation that he asked Subaru to be his grandson but didn't finish the sentence because he knows how cruel that would sound if Reinhard were to hear it. However, that doesn't stop me from considering both options as valid. But tell me, what do you think Wilhelm wanted to say to Subaru?